So, hello to this live stream and meetup for web front-end basics. We're very excited. It's our first meetup, and the idea was basically because we have a new junior developer, Debbie, who's sitting here, and we thought about ways to kind of get her to the basics of web development and what we could do, and we thought about like once a week we could do for 1 hour a little basics training about all what is like the really basics of web development, and didn't want to focus so much on the hows, but on the whys and what of basic web development. And then we thought, if we already prepare all those things, if we already do it, why don't we do a meetup out of this? And here we are. So welcome again. And our today's topic is the JavaScript ecosystem overview. We chose this because, well, the JavaScript ecosystem is huge. There's a new tool almost every day popping up. There's Webpack, there's React, there's Angular, there's, I don't know, Babel, there's TypeScript, there's so many things, and it's really easy to get confused about what those tools do, what they are for, and it's really easy to kind of lose the overview what is out there. So today we just want to give you this overview about some technologies that we use in our company here at Virtual Identity and that we think are good, and also some tools that we don't use, but just we think right now they're hyped and they're very important. Yeah. This is Mark. You want to say a few words?
I'm Mark. I'm a creative developer here at Virtual Identity and doing crazy creative stuff with a lot of animation. And yeah, I prepared this meetup with David together, and let's see what came out.
Yeah, I totally forgot to introduce myself. I'm David. I'm a full stack developer here at Virtual Identity. And I'm doing JavaScript for 6 years now, I think. And I started back in the days when it all started with Node.js, like when it was still in version 0.6 or something. And it was all quite new. And I fell in love with JavaScript back then, and I'm in love ever since with it. So, yep. Okay. Let's start with a brief overview of what we are going to present today. We kind of clustered it. On the top left, you see Node.js, which is the base of everything, which started JavaScript, or what made JavaScript what it is today. And also NPM, which basically is the package manager for JavaScript. We're going to talk about some front-end frameworks. You see them on the bottom left. We're going to talk about Vue.js, React, Angular, and Ember. We're also going to talk about some build tools like Babel and Webpack. We will talk about a compiled JavaScript language, which is TypeScript. And last but not least, we are going to talk about Gulp and Grunt as task runners / build tools. And we're going to go into detail what those things mean on every slide.
Yeah, and then we hope to have not just a presentation, but also a discussion. So questions from your side, and also if you have points to add or other opinions, we are open to that.
Sure.
Also in the chat for the live stream for our amazing viewers out there.
Yep. All right. Then let's start with Node.js. What is Node.js? As I said, I was there when it all started. Basically, Node.js is a runtime environment for JavaScript. And back in the days, JavaScript, like 6 years ago, was mostly run in the browser. And there were some tools, but it was not really famous to have it run on the server. And Node.js introduced that. It was, I think, Ryan Dahl was his name, and he thought, well, I already have to learn one language, JavaScript, for the front end. Why can't I use this language in the back end? So he created Node.js with this thought in mind, and it became more. These days, I'd say, I'm not sure, like I don't have any statistics, but I'd say that Node.js is mostly used these days to run JavaScript packages locally on a developer machine and help you develop web applications. And basically, it's just a wrapper around V8. V8 is the JavaScript interpreter or the JavaScript runtime of the Chrome browser. And if you want to summarize Node.js, as I said before, it lets you run JavaScript files on your computer. And that is the basis for everything else that we have in modern front-end web development today.
Without the need of a browser.
Without the need of a browser, exactly. Like you don't have to start a browser and kind of load the JavaScript there, but you can go to your command line and you can type Node and run every JavaScript file that is there. And of course, Node.js is much more. Node.js is also a library where you can access the file system, you can send HTTP requests, you can start TCP and HTTP servers, you can start child processes on your computer. So it's a big library and runtime environment in once. That is Node.js. Any questions about Node.js?
You're also welcome to pop in questions afterwards, if it fits.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the next really huge thing, which is NPM. So you can think about NPM as the package manager for JavaScript. What is a package manager? Basically, it just holds a whole lot of tools, plugins, modules for you to download and put into your application at your own will. So I always say that basically the whole JavaScript ecosystem is within NPM these days. There were some other package managers for JavaScript like Bower, maybe you may have heard about it, but it's not that famous anymore because like NPM just has everything these days. And before NPM, you actually, if you wanted to build a web application and you wanted to include a plugin, you had to download it manually and you had to place it somewhere on your web server and you had to go to your HTML file and include it there. And those steps are basically, you don't have to do them today anymore. There was someone in our light. And yeah, up to this day, NPM has more than 500,000 packages. So 500,000 JavaScript modules that you can use in your application. So a whole lot of functionality that you don't have to implement yourself anymore, but you can just go out there and use it. And NPM makes it actually really easy for you to manage the dependencies of your application. So if you want to use a certain plugin, let's say you're building a web page where you want to use a slider, like with images, then you can just use NPM, install that plugin locally in your application, and it will version the plugin for you. So if the plugin has a bug, and there will be a bug fix published, you basically get that automatically if you run npm install, that's a command. You will just get this bug fix. You don't have to go to the website of the plugin and download this thing manually anymore, but npm manages this for you. So yeah, npm is basically the access point to the whole JavaScript wonderland.
It also often happens that you write something down in JavaScript and then you Google for more plugins and you don't find them, and some days later you go again to the npm registry and suddenly it pops up and then you say, okay, it was there all the time, why didn't I do it? And so I would always say just take a look at the npm repository, what is in there before you start doing something.
Yeah, and the nice thing about npm, everything in there is open source. Yep. So if you find a bug and you don't want to wait for someone to fix it, you just go there and fix it yourself. Or if you want to have a look at how something is implemented, you can just have a look at it. So I like that very much about npm. All right. Any questions about npm? All right. Yeah. npm?
So the question was, which language is npm written in?
Actually, I don't know.
We don't know.
I really don't know. All right. The next thing is Babel. What is Babel? I'm going to start from the beginning. These days you may have heard that there's a thing called ECMA script, which is basically the specification for JavaScript. And JavaScript has different versions. And for a long time, the version of JavaScript was ECMA 5, I think. Yeah. And it lacks certain features or certain syntax things that are way better these days with new ECMA specification and also with new JavaScript versions. The problem now is that different browsers don't support those new versions. Like there's a really new language feature of like, I don't know, class statements in JavaScript, but actually you're not able to use them because you have to support Internet Explorer 11 or something. So that really is frustrating because you have something you can use, you have a language that already would make it easy for you to write some beautiful code, but you cannot use it because the browser doesn't support it. So that's where Babel comes into play. Basically, Babel is a compiler that does nothing else but take the new language feature that you've wrote and compile them down to something that older browsers understand. So you can think of it like a compiler or maybe a converter. And it has a lot of plugins, and with those plugins, it even allows for extensions of the JavaScript language, like things that are not there yet, that are not specified yet, but that may be a good idea. One of the most famous examples is JSX, which is the files or the how you say, the syntax used by the React front-end framework. Who has heard about React? Heard? Okay. So basically in React, you write those JSX files, which is a mix of JavaScript and HTML. So you can write HTML directly in your JavaScript files. You don't have to write an HTML file or use a JavaScript string to write HTML, but you just write it inside your JavaScript file, and the Babel compiler would compile it down to pure JavaScript. So you have a JSX file, you have some HTML in there, and then you run it through Babel, and what comes out is basically pure JavaScript, which will render this HTML that you've written. So as you can see, Babel is actually pretty powerful because you can extend the language to your will. I mean, probably it's not always a good idea to do this, but for example, JSX is really, really great, and it really makes it easy to write beautiful web applications.
And also to mention, also naturally, ES7 is also in there. Like the most new features are also in Babel, so you can also write in ES7 the even newer version of JavaScript.
Yeah, you don't have to wait for the browsers to implement them before you can use them. That's like the biggest advantage of Babel. Yeah. Again, sorry.
Does this work with all features or other limitations?
He asked if it works with all features or if there are limitations. It depends. If you have a plugin, it will work with all features.
So with the all language features which are defined right now, yeah. But if you have written your own, let's say your own language, you have to write a plugin for Babel, and it will work then too.
All right, let's continue. From Babel to Webpack. What is Webpack? Webpack is a build tool. What does build tool mean? Basically, a build tool bundles together, your application. This means it takes all assets, all JavaScript files, all HTML that you have in your application, and it puts them together to a minimum package that you can just use and deploy on the server, and your web page runs. The reason you need this is that while you're developing, often your application looks very different than when you actually deploy it. So, for example, when you're developing, you don't want to develop all in a single file. But when your application is on production, you don't want to have the browser download 20 JavaScript files where you have your code. You basically want as least files as possible to kind of reduce the payload that the browser has to download for your application. So this is why you also use things like Minification. Is everybody known about Minification? Hello there.
Who knows about Minification?
Minification is, well, how do I describe it best? It takes out all the clutter out of your JavaScript. And for example, probably the easiest way to think about it is if you have a very long variable name, minification will make it one letter for you. I mean, that is terribly readable, but you don't need readable JavaScript when you deploy it, because the computer understands also terribly written JavaScript. And by doing this, by reducing the signs that you use or the characters that you use in your JavaScript file, you reduce the file size of JavaScript. And so you can basically, during the development you have like 2 megabytes of JavaScript, you can reduce this to a few kilobytes or a few hundred kilobytes probably. So minification is just making your files so small as small as possible while still being readable. I can just
There are multiple levels of minification. Like you can leave your variables named if you need them for a debug, for example, and take out the line breaks or something. Or you can also, like I said, that's called uglify the file. And as you said, for example, you have the variable name in there. Replace name with C, for example, and you cannot read it afterwards, but it will make the file smaller.
And the file will still work.
Yeah.
So that's the important thing. It just makes it as small as possible.
And now imagine doing this by hand.
Yeah. You don't want to do this. And it does not only do minification, it also builds up like a tree of dependencies in your JavaScript files. For this to understand, you also have to go back a little bit in how web development was done before. If you had a plugin, or if you wanted certain references across JavaScript files, what you had to do is include all those files in your HTML head. So if you had
in the correct order.
In the correct order. If you had a slider plugin that needed to be initialized before your actual application was initialized, you had to go to your index.html or whatever and put script tag and put the slider plugin there, and then you had to put another script tag, and then you put your own JavaScript there. And like with 2 files, that's okay. But if you're developing a huge application and you have like 1,000 JavaScript files, that is kind of not handleable anymore. So Webpack allows you to use import statements. This is also a new JavaScript specification. It will work soon by default, but up to this point it only works with a build tool like Webpack. And Webpack will automatically resolve those imports. Like, so for example, if you need that slider plugin in your application, you put an import statement in your application, and Webpack will put that slider code automatically in there.
And you put the imports in the JavaScript file,
Yeah.
not in the HTML anymore, so you just have maybe one JavaScript file included in the HTML, and then in there it imports all the scripts it needs.
And this is really powerful because you don't have to worry about including your JavaScript files anymore and don't include them in the right order, or you forgot something, but it will just happen automatically. And so this is way less error prone, and it takes away the fear to use many files for your application. And that is very good. And besides that, you can not only include JavaScript anymore, you can include CSS files, you can include images, HTML, all those kind of things. You can just use Webpack and it will bundle it together automatically and make an application out of it. So that's actually really, really powerful.
And I think one more thing you forgot was the other way around. If you have a huge mass of JavaScript, and let's say you have a page where you just have a home page, and on another page you have a complex application, you don't want the user to load the whole JavaScript needed for the main page on the main for the application page on the main page. So what Webpack also supports is modularization, which you basically say this is module A, this is module B, and you can work as you would before with your code, and in the minify process it will split those up and say that that's file A, that's file B, and I can import only the JavaScript code I need to run for a small page on the small page, and if I need the application code I can go to the other page and load the application JavaScript.
Yeah, and one more thing that you might hear when someone talks about Webpack is this thing called tree shaking. And tree shaking basically is an elimination of code that you don't use. So if you include a certain plugin, go back to the slider and you use only one feature of that slider, before you had to import the file and the whole slider module was imported in your application. You had to download the whole slider file basically in the browser. Now Webpack realizes, oh, you only use this one function out of this file. It will delete all the other code and therefore again make your bundle way smaller. So the goal is always to have the smallest bundle possible in your client, in your browser. Because think about if you're in the train and you have an Edge connection that downloads with how much? 2 bytes a second. It makes a difference. It really makes a difference if your application is 50 kilobyte or if it's 500 kilobytes. So it has a huge impact. Yeah.
Any open questions there or any notes?
The question was if it compiles less. Yes, you can. There's loaders that will do that for you. Basically, you can do. I think you can.
So loaders are the
everything.
plugins for Webpack, and you can add, like, as he said, less SAS, images, HTML for everything you need and extra. And you can write your own loader, which you tell what to do, basically.
All right. Then,
Okay.
great.
Yeah, now it's my part.
Gulp.
So from the Webpack, we switch over to Gulp, which basically can also do all the stuff Webpack does, but a little less. So Gulp is a task runner, which means, as the name says, it runs tasks for you, but you have to configure it and tell it how to run tasks. Gulp is, I think, was the huge hit before Webpack, as I recall. And basically, you have this Gulp file, which you set somewhere. It's a pure JavaScript file. And then you define your multiple tasks in JavaScript. I have an example later. And then you pipe the source files through. So let's say you have a SCSS file. There are 2 things you need to do. You need to compile it to CSS, and then maybe also do an autocompleter, which adds the browser-specific extensions. So you pipe it through your task. So you have a task compile SCSS and a task auto prefix was the word. And so basically right now there are 3,349 plugins right now for Gulp.js, which you could use, which do a lot of predefined stuff. Sometimes I always wonder why would I use it, but the plugins are there. And if you go to the next slide, or give me just the thing, we can see how such a task looks. Well, so we define the task some name, and just pass as a second argument the function. And we take some source file and pipe it through the different tasks which we defined in other files. Or those tasks are defined by the plugins. So what you see here is basically pure JavaScript enhanced with libraries, which runs in Node.js again. And was it for Gulp?
Yeah, it's basically all those Gulp plugins that you were talking about are nothing more in its core. If you look at them, mostly they're nothing more than a command line wrapper. Yep. So there are certain tools that you can do on your command line, like this Jade or Minify. You can go to your terminal and you type Minify on not on a Jade, probably on a Jade file, I don't know, but whatever comes out of Jade, and it will do exactly the same as this plugin does. Only with this plugin, you can give it to the next and to the next and to the next and pipe it. Yeah. So yeah, Gulp was good for that. But these days, I'm not a big fan of Gulp anymore. Exactly because of this, I made some experiences that there were certain version updates. What are you laughing?
I know your experience.
Yeah. There were version updates to those command line tools, like Minification or other tools. But the Gulp plugin is still on the old version. So you cannot use the new features because you use Gulp. But the new features are already there. So
And the plugins are maybe won't even get developed anymore
yeah,
any further. Yeah. So from Gulp we go, I would say, one step back to Grunt, which is also a task runner. And basically, instead of a Gulp file, you have the Grunt file, which is also JavaScript, but in comparison to Gulp, it has a lot more of convention you have to follow to get your tasks to run. You have to config before you run the tasks. Like in the Gulp Gulp files, for example, you just define your tasks and you have an input and an output. And here, before you even run Gulp, you have to know which plugins you will use and define them beforehand. That's a huge disadvantage, I would say. And Grunt is older, so that's why we have nearly twice as many plugins as Gulp. But the user count also went down, so it was Grunt was the big thing, then there came Gulp, and now there's Webpack. So it replaced each other because Webpack can do more and better.
Yeah, basically, what the problem with Grunt is you have to configure it, and the configuration is really hard. You tend to have configuration files that are several hundred lines long, sometimes even longer, and it's really hard to, in the end, like if the file is so big, to get it to do what you actually want. And with Gulp, this was made easier because with Gulp, you didn't configure anymore, but you actually wrote those pipes, you wrote code. So you didn't have to get a configuration file like with Grunt, but you could write your own code, and therefore you had some logic. And with this logic, it was easier to get it to do what you actually wanted to do. And then the newest Webpack, it's also, again, back to configuration, but way simpler configuration, because they just do so many things already out of the box that you would have to configure with Grunt, but Webpack just does them.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
So Grunt was configuration and much of code to write to make it run.
Yeah.
Gulp was less configuration and more code to run, and now it's the other way around. We have nearly only configuration and no more code to run because everything is packed in Webpack.
Yeah.
And if anybody would ask me as a new beginner where to start, I would say if you have no idea of build tools or anything around it, I would start with Gulp right now just to get into the thinking, but only see it as a way to Webpack. So because Webpack, as we said, does a lot of other things, which give a huge overhead on your files. So Gulp is good for beginners to get into the thinking of piping and of tasks and how to define them, and then you should change to Webpack.
Yes. The question was, why not write a simple shell script? Sometimes you can do this. If you're familiar with the CLI, with the command line interface, or with your terminal, sometimes that can be good enough. Like, for example, npm even allows you to, it has a package JSON file, and it allows you to write scripts in there and execute command line statements through npm. So you have a uniform interface. For example, there's npm start is a command that you can put in your command line, and you can define what npm start will do. And these days, npm start will almost always start the developer version of the application or the package or whatever you're currently in. So if it's a kind of a uniformed interface for however you're going to start your application. But the problem with those scripts is that they tend to get really large, and they're not environment, not specific, the other way. Like they're environment specific. Like you have to realize what machine you're running on and all those kind of things, and Webpack takes that away from you.
Yeah. So you basically have a huge team with Mac, Linux, and Windows, and it will run on all machines.
And it also takes away from you lots of where to get files and, all this logic. You don't have to write it yourself anymore. This logic is already implemented. With Webpack, you just configure, you say, oh, here's my entry point, and then it will do a lot of things automatically already for you.
Any more questions to task runners, Webpack, Gulp, Grunt? Okay, so I think we will just. I think one more. I think I have a look at the Grunt file, for example. So as you see here, there's a relatively huge configuration for just a simple task, which Webpack will do out of the box. And then you just run it down there.
Yeah.
How are the task runners, how are they invoked? Do you run them manually or every time you save, or how do you start them?
The question was how you invoke or how you start those task runners, usually through your CLI in the terminal. And these days, most of them have a watch mode. So the watch mode just watches the files that you're working on, and whenever you change something, it will automatically start the whole build process again.
Or parts of it.
Or parts
So
of
you
it.
define what will happen. So you can watch SCSS files, and if one changes, do the SCSS build process, and the same for all the other.
Yeah, and that was really a turnaround in web development, exactly this watching thing and building thing, because these days when you develop, you actually have this task running, and you make a change to your JavaScript or HTML, and it gets reflected in your browser almost immediately without you having to do anything anymore. Like, you don't have to go back to your browser and hit F5 or start again the task and build the whole application and then go to your browser and hit F5 to see the new application. No, you just change a file and it will automatically build it on your browser and reload the page
On all
for you.
browsers that are connected to the server.
Yeah.
So you can also have multiple devices open and just develop, and it will automatically refresh.
Or even more nice, there's this thing called hot module replacement, where you don't even have to reload the page anymore after a change. Like, it works with Webpack, for example, Webpack and React, but it will just change what changed on the page directly. So you can if you have a H1 and a text inside of it in React, and you change the text, you can see it in the browser how it changes without reloading the page. So that's kind of like live editing in HTML, and that's really cool.
Which is really great if you have a big application that takes like 5 seconds to load, or like a video and it has to play, and on the end you show something, and you can stay in the state where you are right now and just update. That's
yeah. Like, if you have a huge navigation and what you're building on is like 5 clicks away, before or every time you reload it, you have to do those 5 clicks, and again you have to do those 5 clicks, and you change and have to do 5 clicks. But these days it just updates automatically, and you don't have to do those 5 clicks anymore, but you can just work on it instantaneously. So it's a very fast feedback, and through that you can work more concentrated on what you're doing right now. All right. Any more questions about build tools? Else we will jump into JS frameworks. All right.
In JS frameworks, we will also just get a little overview of what's the differences in everything, not to get deeper into.
Yeah, and first of all, I will actually explain what are JS frameworks, at least what I understand with JS frameworks. I don't know if this is the big definition or the right definition, but JS frameworks for me are basically this. They do actually just one thing. They do DOM manipulation for you. This is how it all started. Like, of course, they do hell of a lot more, but to the core, if you really want to get the essence of a JS framework, it does DOM manipulation for you. So if you want to have certain dynamic features on your page, you have to alter your DOM, right? You have to alter the HTML that is on your page. If you have a slider and you click on the right, it has to slide the image. And the way to do this before was to actually go there with JavaScript, find that slider, and then execute code that will change the HTML to the state that you want to have it in. Or if you open a modal or something, you would have to go to that, change the style or the class that will actually open the HTML for you.
Or you may know the jQuery append, prepend, HTML. Those are all the things that this does.
And this, yeah, this has some certain disadvantages because DOM manipulation is hard, it's imperative, it's hard to test and hard to get right. And yeah, just to summarize it, basically, in other words, JS frameworks synchronize the state of your JavaScript with your HTML for you. So you don't have to go there and change the HTML anymore, but you just change your object in JavaScript. Like, for example, you have an object with a title property that says hello world. And the JS framework will take that title and put it into your HTML. And if a user types something and this title property changes, the HTML will change, but you don't have to take care of the HTML change. So that's also why we need it. State change or state handling is very difficult. It's easy if you just have a little bit of state in your application, but it's very hard if you have a lot of state. Like, is everybody familiar with the state concept?
Who's not familiar with the
Who's
state
not
concept?
familiar with state?
Okay.
So how can I explain state?
State is basically, if you look at the page and all you see is the state of the page. Like if you select a drop-down, the value is the state of the page. And everything you see is in the state, basically.
Yeah, maybe in other words, everything that is dynamic on the page, everything that would be filled in a template or something.
I wouldn't limit it to that, because also the
It's
static
more, yeah.
headline is also part of the state of it. It won't change,
Can be.
but it's part of the state.
Can be, yeah. So state is things that can change your page. That's why I said kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
And yeah, as I said, it's very difficult. Like it gets difficult if certain parts of your application should have the same state. Think about a shopping cart at Amazon. You on the top right, you have always the shopping cart where you can go to the cart with a number in it. And then you go to that cart page and you see the items that you have in your cart. Now you delete an item. You want the number on the top right to go down to 2, right? So actually you have the state is the items in your cart are your state, and you want to have it reflected once in the cart on the page. You want to see the items that you have, the 2 items that you have left maybe, and you also want this number, those 2 items, reflected on the top right. So if you have to implement this imperatively, you would have to listen to a change user deletes, and then you would have to go to the card itself and remove the element that was just deleted, and then you would also have to go to the card on the top right and reduce the number to 2. With the JS framework, you turn it around. You tell the card on the top right, here, you listen to this variable, the length of the items in my cart. You will always reflect what is the length of the items in my cart. And then you go to your cart and you say, here, you always will reflect what is in my cart. All those objects that are in my cart, you will show them. So now as soon as you delete an item in your cart, the length is updated automatically in your JavaScript, because if you have an array there, it will only have 2 elements. And by declaring it, like declaratively, it will update on every part of your page where it is referenced. So is the difference kind of clear? You don't have to say, you are 2 now and you are this, but you say more like, you are always what is here and you are always what is here.
Which is maybe not that not that important for 2 references, but you may have other references somewhere on the page too.
The what? MV?
Model view
MVC?
model.
MV. Yeah, exactly. Basically, it's this. Like you always have the model, your model reflected in the HTML, and you don't have to go there and do it manually anymore. So yeah, that's one of the things that are really handled by JS frameworks. Also, of course, testing DOM state is hard. Like if you want to have automated tests, are you familiar with automated tests? Well, it's basically very simple. If you have a calculator, you have an add function in your code. It should add 2 numbers. Of course, you could, to test if it does the right thing, if 2 plus 3 is 5, you could always go through your user interface and type 2 plus 3 and do this manually. But this is something the computer can do for you automatically. You can write a test where you tell the computer, okay, I call this function with 2 and 3, and if it's not 5, what comes out of it, there must be an error. So tell me if it's not 5. And you can automate this. You can have again, go to your command line and type a test or execute this test, and then the computer will tell you, oh, there's something wrong. And to test something like this, like an add function, when it's JavaScript, that's really easy because, well, you just call the function. But as soon as you have to access the DOM, it gets way more harder because you kind of would have to render the page, and then find that element that you kind of expect to be where it should be. So for example, before, with the cards, if you say, I always want to have that the length of the card should be 2 if I only have 2 items in there, it's really hard to do this in HTML because you kind of would have to search for that element and then go in the text and kind of see if the text is 2 or whatever. But if you just think about an object, you just ask, does this array have the length of 2? That's it.
Because you know the framework takes away your you don't have to do the DOM manipulation, so you know if it's 2, it will display 2. So you can test just the JavaScript.
And it's not just automatic testing, but also like if you have to debug something. You don't have to look in your HTML, but you just look at your JavaScript and see if it does the right thing. Then again, also DOM manipulation is hard to do right. It's like really easy if you manipulate the DOM yourself to kind of have performance issues. Think about a huge table with several thousand items, and you go there and just one item changes and you render all 1,000 again. Of course, that is not really good. Modern JS frameworks will handle this for you. They will just render what changed in your DOM. So this has a huge performance impact. And of course, you could probably achieve this yourself and write this yourself, but why reinvent the wheel?
Also security-wise, you could, if you just infuse the HTML, you have to, with jQuery, for example, you have to take care of the security yourself and make sure there's no script tags in it, which user can use to access cookies or something to get user data. And those frameworks normally forbid to add HTML as a string in there.
Yeah, and the last thing is it allows component-based development. This means that instead of having one big page with everything on it, you try to get little components. You try to compose your web page out of little elements. Like, as I said before, you have this little card item on the top right, and you have a card, and then you maybe have a navigation, and all those things could be components. And through this state synchronization that I said before, it's really easy to encapsulate those components and let them just do one thing and one thing only, and let it do very easy.
So basically, if you have, for example, two React apps or something, you can take the component out of one app and put it into another, and it would work if you did it right, if you encapsulated it.
Yeah. All right. Any questions about general JS frameworks? Else we will dive into some of them. Dive in. Let's start with Angular, because it all started with Angular, basically. Angular JS, the first Angular version, was one of the first, I'm not sure if it was the first, but actually it was the first really famous JavaScript framework, which did exactly all those things that I described before. And it's actually developed by Google. And these days, Angular JS, the first version, is actually outdated. You shouldn't use it anymore. You should switch to Angular 2, which is now Angular 4, which is, I think, since this week, Angular 5. So as you can see, they kind of, Angular is not like before, it doesn't exist Angular 1 and Angular 2, but it does exist Angular JS and Angular. I just put those version numbers there because you will see them. But Angular 2, 4, and 5 are basically the same. It's just some little upgrades they did there. It's not a complete rewrite or another framework. They just changed the way they're versioning the things. It's like React. I think React is in version 16 now. So it's just like there will be a new version probably every, I don't know, half year. So don't get confused by it. If there's suddenly, you're working with Angular 5 and suddenly there's Angular 10, you didn't miss too much. And what is so unique about Angular, it's not just a view manipulation library, like I said before, but it offers a large toolkit to build huge front-end, corporate front-end applications. Like it has a lot of things. Things like Dependency Injection. Have you ever heard of it? Angular has a really good way of doing this and has all this functionality to build an application. Basically, if you use Angular, you don't need so many plugins anymore.
Because they have them packed in.
Because they basically already have them packed in.
It won't limit the file size.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to talk more about Angular, but talk about React. React is the JS framework developed by Facebook. They also use it for Facebook, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, probably if they develop it.
That's the, just a side note, that's the the point how React got, or why React got invented was exactly your example, because at Facebook they had this chat, and if you got a new message and you didn't had the focus on the chat, you get a 1 up there for a new message. And they couldn't handle to do this an easy way, and so they said, hey, we need something. And so they created React.
Yeah, if you're a big company, you just invent your own JavaScript framework there. Okay, let's do it. React differs from Angular in such that, first of all, it really focuses mostly on DOM manipulation and components. It doesn't bring things like modularization. It doesn't bring you something like, bring some sort of state management, but not too much. And also not like dependency injection, all those things. It's really just focusing on the components, like to bundle together HTML and JavaScript. So with Angular, you can also write your logic, but with React, basically you have to write the with Angular, it makes it easy to write your logic. With React, you have to basically do it yourself, which doesn't make it less or more powerful. It's just a little bit different than Angular. So whenever you see an Angular versus React comparison, in my opinion, that doesn't make much sense because it's just different. It's like apple and peaches.
It depends on the case you have to use it.
Yeah. And the thing that is like really unique about React is what I said before. It uses the special JSX files, which, as I said before, is a combination of HTML and JavaScript. You write HTML directly in your JavaScript, and it will be compiled to pure JavaScript that will have those HTML elements correctly as strings, or I don't really know how they do it, but at the right place. And the cool thing about React is that you can import those components through JavaScript. So if you have a slider, you can import this whole slider in JavaScript in your application and use it there. And it makes it really easy to understand the way your application is structured. You don't have to jump between HTML and JavaScript and HTML and JavaScript, but it's bundled together.
I think the important thing you didn't mention is it's a new way of thinking, because you don't do HTML structure first and then add the JavaScript functionality, but also the app starts just from JavaScript. You have one JavaScript file which initiates the app, and React, Angular, whichever, takes care of rendering the whole application. So if you just have a React application on your page, if you just open the page and you have no JavaScript enabled, you will say a blank page because it won't start.
Yeah. Or maybe another way to say it is, with React, you can store HTML in a JavaScript variable and then do whatever you like with it. So that is actually really cool, because think about a table again, about our cart. You can have a cart item component maybe, which is just one line of your product. And then you can store several of those components in a JavaScript array and just loop over it and build your table with JavaScript. You don't have to use a special template syntax, like there's some, have you ever done a PHP or JSPs or something? Lots of time there's something like a special HTML syntax that allows you to do things like for loops, like duplicating certain elements according to your model. But with React, you don't need this syntax. You don't need this additional HTML syntax because you just do it with JavaScript. So you don't need an additional logic framework or an additional logic in your HTML, but you already know how to do it because it's JavaScript. So that's also one big advantage. Yeah. And often if you hear React, you will hear Redux. I don't want to go too much into detail because Redux is a little bit more advanced, but Redux
I think we can do an extra meetup on this
yeah,
topic.
Is a really cool state management tool. It makes it really easy to synchronize your state across your application by a thing called CQRS, which is Client Query Segregation. Oh God, I don't even know what it stands for. Well, yeah, it's advanced. We're going to talk about it maybe next time. Ember.
Which goes to Ember. Ember basically matches up with Angular because it also don't gives you just the view manipulation, but also it adds a controller framework around it, so you can do model view controller applications there. And so because of those extra features it gives you, it also comes with a lot of convention, so convention over configuration. You have to follow the way Ember does it to make it work, in comparison with React, where you just write your own JavaScript and you define your own style of code. Yeah, I think I said everything.
Yeah, well, one cool thing about Ember, it has this thing called evolutionary development. So with Ember, you can actually seamlessly if Ember upgrades, you can seamlessly upgrade your application, because they will make it like from version to version. They will not have super big breaking changes, but they will kind of leave the stuff in until you are ready to upgrade your application. So you can always stay up to date. It's harder with Angular, for example. So just a quick story. We started with Angular 2, the new Angular, when it was still in the beta phase. And we thought, it's in the beta phase, so it will be like in version 1.0 soon. And they updated Angular in this beta phase, I think, 15 times with a lot of breaking changes. So every time they updated, we had to spend like 1 or 2 days to fix our application with the new version. This won't happen with Ember, because Ember makes it easy for you to not have breaking changes, to not have to change your whole application, but they kind of tell you which way to go.
Next. There comes Vue, which is the new kid on the block. It's just a Vue framework which handles DOM manipulation, DOM updates, and so as I wrote, there is no routing, state, anything. It just gives you the nearly same as React. It's in close to React in the syntax. And so it's also easy to pick up, to get into this way of thinking of application. So if I would have to put those frameworks together, I would say it's Vue and React and Ember and Angular. And basically it's dependent if you have this app will be huge, you have to develop, and you don't have that much time to set up your project. Just take Ember or Angular, because they take a lot of responsibility from you. And if you have to, it's a lot of time you can invest, and you have to do several tasks which Ember or Angular won't do that well. You can switch to Vue or React. Yeah, that's it.
That's it about frameworks. Yeah. The question was which frameworks we are using. We are using Angular 2 and React mostly these days. A little bit of
I think we use this, but a whole group of the company in Freiburg uses the Vue for development daily, I think. Yeah. Any more questions? Then let's go to next.
All right. Actually, you can have it now.
Yeah, Toolkits. So we take a step back from the huge overhead of an application, and we just, let's say we write an add function or something, and it gets more complex. We need some enhancements. And that's what those toolkits are I will talk about. I think if you are a beginner in JavaScript, you will know a lot of them, because they are mentioned everywhere in the forums. And so I will start with jQuery, for example. I think mostly every web developer has heard of jQuery. And so I will just give a brief overview. It's very good at DOM manipulation. If you have to do it yourself, it's very good done by jQuery. And it's an all-rounder, which implicit comes with that it's a huge library. Because if you can do a lot of stuff, you have to have the code for doing this lot of stuff. So if okay, I use a lot of features of jQuery, I could just include the whole jQuery framework. Otherwise, I have to feature by feature, which I would use of jQuery, to include all the separate scripts. Like if I just use the slider of jQuery UI, for example, I can just include this file, but I have to keep track of all the files I include and also update them, and that's where NPM comes into play and all those stuff. But yeah, it's a huge library and has many, many plugins. I think I haven't found a number, so there's no registry somewhere I could search through, but it's a lot of plugins because everybody used it some years ago and it was the main huge thing.
Yeah, it was basically the standard for, I don't know, 2001 to 2009 or 10. So for a whole lot of years it was the standard because, as you said, it's like an all-rounder. It kind of made up for some language features that were missing in JavaScript. For example, if you wanted to loop over an object properties, you couldn't really do this easily with JavaScript, but jQuery just gave you the for each function where you could do it. And there's a lot of examples that jQuery just was good at back in the days, but these days with all those modern tools, I'm not sure if you really, really need it still.
Yeah, well, that's why I said just use it if you have to use it, and otherwise stick with other solutions like pure JavaScript.
Yeah.
ES6.
Yeah, actually, JavaScript is so advanced these days, also in the browser with the DOM access, that what jQuery made easy is now also easy with pure JavaScript. So why have the overhead of jQuery?
And it's not that hard to transform. So if you still have just written jQuery, just take a few baby steps and start with implementing some ES6 features, for example, at some places in your code, but you can still use the jQuery all around for DOM manipulation, for example, because that's still kind of pain in pure JavaScript.
Yeah. Just to also give it a good point, because of all those many plugins, you will find almost all functionality somehow implemented with jQuery. So if you build your little page where it doesn't matter so much about state and all those things, you could still use jQuery just because of this many, many plugins that you can use.
Okay. Any questions? So we'll go on with Lodash, which is basically also a huge toolkit. It's a utility library and is I wrote all the things down there. It has modular importing and all the stuff, but the main feature is that it's very good at array manipulation and array looping, and it has a lot of functions which makes it easy to handle arrays. And I think that's also the most points I saw Lodash used for array manipulation and array looping, doing stuff with arrays, which mostly also all the functions are implemented in ES6 now. So yeah, depends on what you need, but I would say you can write also a lot of things without Lodash because Lodash is not that easy to partially implement, I would say. It was harder than jQuery, I felt like. Questions to Lodash? Otherwise, to the last and most loved one, Ramda. Ramda is a library we discovered, I think, half a year ago, maybe. And I don't think it was that big, or is that big? I'm not sure. But it's basically a library for functional programming. So I would just have a top view of functional programming, which just says you put one thing, for pure functions, which you create is just you put one thing in, and you always are sure you get another thing out. So for example, for the add function, you put in 2 and 3, and you always know it will get the output of 5. That's pure functions. And Ramda is basically just a set of pure functions. For example, we have the add function. We also have a merge function which merges 2 objects, which very easy to just call merge and then add 2 objects, and you get a merged object out there. And it's also very small for the things it can do. So it makes it easy to write atomic function and most important, easy readable functions. So I think we have to do a separate meetup for Ramda, but basically you can just say, create a function add and multiply, and use some functionality of Ramda, which is nearly the same as in the Gulp pipe, where you take one thing and pipe it to the next function. You can do this with Ramda too, and just say, okay, I will pipe first the 2 and the 5 in the add function, and then the result in the multiply function with 2. So I will get the added result multiplied by 2. It's just a simple overview. I would recommend we do a meetup on this too.
Yeah, you can think of Ramda as a little bit like Lego.
Yeah.
You don't have to create your own pieces, but you just use what is there and put it together the way you want. And with Ramda, sometimes you can implement a lot of functionality without actually writing a single function. You just use what Ramda already gives you, and you kind of
Stick it together.
You stick it together in something that is actually really readable and almost reads like text. And that's really cool about it. That's what I love about it.
Yeah. We have a priest over here, the Ramda priest.
I'm not a Ramda priest. I was just converted. I'm
Yeah.
a Ramda believer, maybe.
Yeah. And I think the last thing I wrote, it's hard to learn because it's another way of thinking of JavaScript. So it's hard to get in. As with ES6, jQuery, you can take baby steps and use some functionality out of there, but it takes a long time to get into or to get to the thinking. That's what we experienced.
Yeah, I mean you can use it very easily because it has same functions as Lodash, for example. So a for each or a map function to iterate over collections, and you can use it like this. Just call one function out of it, but that's not where the power lies. If you really want to use it with the power that it has, it's harder to learn exactly because of this, because you have to get in this certain thinking, and it took, I think, 2 or 3 months for me to kind of get it. And after that, I was amazed. Yeah.
And that's the end of the toolkit section, but it's just some toolkits we use as a daily basis, but there are many, many out there. So it's a lot of JavaScript libraries which do the same and which do several of the pieces maybe better, but those are the ones we use daily. Yeah. Which brings us to the last point, TypeScript, which is basically a superset of JavaScript. Who of you have written TypeScript before? Oh. Okay, the half of our audience has written TypeScript before. So basically, it's just it needs compilation, so you need to compile it before you can run it in the browser, because from TypeScript you have to go to JavaScript to run in the browser. But it basically adds types and interfaces. I think that's the main thing it's used for in most projects. And so I have an example with me in pure JavaScript. I have a user 1 and a user 2. Both are users. And now I want to display a user profile. I want to display the username and the user age. And the second variable, user 2, would throw an error. Age is undefined because there is no age defined. And until I test it in the browser, I have no idea this would happen if I hadn't had automated tests. What TypeScript does, it adds the possibility to add interfaces, for example. So I created the interface user, and I defined, okay, a user has to have a name, which is a string, and a age, which is a number. And so I also defined the 2 variables again, as I did before. But now, before I can run it in the browser, I have to compile it. And in the compiler, it would throw the error that age is not defined. You have to define age. So it saves me from noticing the error in the browser when the page is maybe even live. And there's one case where in the database there's no age and it wasn't tested before, and it happens that there is no age defined.
Actually, it won't help you with database.
Yeah, sorry.
But it helps you to see also in your editor really quickly if you kind of used an object wrong, or if you misspelled something. For example, if you would name the property of user 2 name 2 or something, or you have an MAE or a typo in there. I mean, the compiler would tell it you, but modern IDEs will already make a little red underline and say, hey, listen, the name is wrongly spelled. It needs to be name.
Yeah. And in the IDE, you also would see that age is missing. It will underline the whole object.
And it also makes it easy for the IDE to give you something that's called Intellisense, which is basically a really good autocompletion. So if you define a new user and you have no idea what property, think about a user with lots of properties, like with not just age, address, and street address, and zip code, and all those things, and you kind of want to create a new user like this. And with pure JavaScript, you kind of have to copy the properties or make sure you write them right. With TypeScript, if you type it, you can just, your IDE will tell you what is there.
You can press autocomplete, and it will fill in all the properties you need empty, basically.
Yep.
And it also helps you to write cleaner code, because you can define the output of a function, for example. So in normal JavaScript code, it could happen that a function sometimes gives back strings, sometimes gives back a Boolean or something, and you can just define, okay, this function should always return a Boolean, and if you return anything else, it will throw in compiler error before you run it in your browser. It's one thing I think it's very good at.
Yeah, basically it gives you a faster feedback.
Yeah. And now you may wonder how to compile this. It's done with Gulp, Grunt, Webpack, whatever you would use, and just run it through the pipe and get it done to JavaScript. And I think that's it for our presentation.
We didn't even have a thank you slide in there.
No. We wanted to make a go out now slide, but
yeah, that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Are there still any questions or anything you're interested in that you want to know?
also for future meetups, we can plan them if you have any topics you want to dive deeper in or anything.
AngularJS deep dive. 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see when we do it, and then let's see which version is the newest one. 70, yeah, maybe. Yeah, sure. We could do this. We will note it down. Maybe some on the meetup page, or yeah, you can write it down. Yeah. We can look it up at YouTube later, he said.
But I have to scroll through the whole video and find the right position.
Yeah. Maybe just make a note of the time. So any more questions? Any tool you heard about that you kind of want to know something about? Good question. They somehow skipped it for some reason, but I don't recall why they did this.
It's like Windows 9, gone forever.
I think even Angular 4 was not, yeah. I think even Angular 4 was not really released. It was Angular 2 and then Angular 5. Yeah, totally. Yeah. That's fixed now, I heard.
So if there isn't anything else,
then thank you very much. That was fun to talk about it.
I think we're both looking forward for the next time.
Yep. We will announce it like normally on the meetup page, and the next time we will kind of make it open, not reduce it to 10. We just did this for testing purposes today. So yeah, then thank you very much for showing up, and see you next time.
Bye.
Maybe take a drink from the fridge now and can have some conversations.
And I think we can now do some cool music overlay in the video, and we can we can't do this.
No, we can't.
Okay, so bye then.
Yeah, thank you.